Hello, my name's Daniel King and welcome to my round 2 play of the day from the FIDE Grand Prix in London. Now, the game I've selected is between Peter Leko from Hungary and Vasily Ivanchuk from Ukraine, and this is a real clash of styles. Of course, we know that Ivanchuk can beat anybody in the world on his day, and he loves these complicated positions, plays some really wild chess. Leko, on the other hand, now a great player, he challenged Kramnik for the world's title in 2004, but he is a steadier player. He likes positional chess, and I think games that have clear strategies suit him much better. So who would win out here? What kind of position would they get? Well, Leko has managed to steer the game into, well, first of all, an endgame, and there are clear strategic ideas here. So he's managed to get his kind of position on the board. And if we look here, Leko with the white pieces, he has the better position. He has managed to open the A file and has penetrated with his rooks down here. Now, he hasn't won any material, but that rook on the A file, of course, can look in this direction. Given half a chance, can end up on one of these squares with pressure. Now, how are the pawn structures? This often tells us a lot about the position. Well, these pawns are potentially weak, but at the moment they can be defended quite easily. And Ivanchuk is holding firm here with his rook and knight. White has to be a little bit careful, actually. Sometimes this pawn can be weak, and don't forget this one. But I think while White has the initiative, these pawns aren't really a problem. So at the moment, Black is holding firm. How does White make progress here? Well, normally there's this rule that if you're going to try and win a game, you need, in an endgame like this, you need 2 weaknesses to play against. Well, you could say that these are potential weaknesses, but nothing doing yet. So Leko makes an excellent decision here. And he decides, before he exchanges rooks and tries to get in with his other rook, he needs to make progress on the king side. So he started the squeeze, h4, excellent move. So he's just waiting before he exchanges rooks here. Now Ivanchuk decides to reposition his rook with rook b7. Now, how do you meet a move like h4? Well, as I said, Ivanchuk tries to maneuver his rook around to a better square. But what would happen if Black played g6 here? Of course, it would be nice to stop the squeeze with h5. The problem is that this weakens both pawns and also weakens the 7th rank. Now, if White were ever to get in with the rook, then this makes the king very vulnerable to checks. So, and I can understand why Black didn't do this, but it's very difficult to meet this kind of squeeze when there's no clear threat. Okay, let's see what happened. So rook b7, h5. So now this pawn is potentially weak on g7. But it's all potential at the moment. It's nothing concrete is happening. So okay, the rook comes to c7, looking at this potential weakness on c2. So perhaps a bit of counterplay there. So in principle, I think this is a reasonable idea from Ivanchuk, actually. Leko took on f8 and now moved the rook in. Okay, this makes sense. So you can see that one day he might perhaps want to come to g8 to hassle this pawn. And sometimes there's the idea of hassling the b pawn as well. Of course, watch out for the knight. It protects b8 at the moment. But there is potential here. But nothing concrete as yet. So Leko continues the squeeze. I love this kind of chess, where there is no clear threat for Black to deal with, but White just steadily improves his position. And if ever one of these pawns were to fall, then you can see that White's pawn, or pawns, are closer to the queening square. So this is nice chess. Knight d8 from Ivanchuk, and now there's a threat here. So the knight came across to defend the c pawn, and of course the knight is very well placed on d4. And Ivanchuk came back with knight c6, and Leko decided to just retreat with the knight. So the position is repeated. The question is, and now Ivanchuk played king f7. Well, we'll see what happens against that in a second. But what would happen if Ivanchuk had just repeated the position? How would Leko have played on from here? Well, I think he'd have repeated again, and if the knight came back, I think he actually has an excellent move here, which he didn't play in the game, but I'm sure he would have the second time around. I think there's a bit of time pressure here, so that's why they're repeating moves. But I'm sure Leko would have played rook to g8, of course attacking this pawn that's been fixed by white's pawns here. If king f7, defending the pawn, then we have a tactic, very common in this kind of endgame. And white is simply winning, well, at least one pawn here. Clear pawn up, and more to come actually. So after rook g8, black plays knight to e5, taking the pawn. And white cashes in. So it's level pawns at the moment, but now rook to g6, attacking the pawn on e6, and also keeping an eye on the pawn on h6 as well. So e5 is the only move to defend, and now knight c6 check, and white wins a pawn. Now the game is not over yet, however it's a clear pawn up, and white's rook is in a really dominating position. And I don't like the position of black's king, because it's cut off by this rook. So I think white has very, very good winning chances there. So I'm sure that would have been the game continuation. But okay, Ivanchuk chose not to repeat again. Perhaps he saw that idea and instead played king f7. He was obviously worried about rook g8. But now the squeeze continues with g5, an excellent move. The threat, simply g6. When the king moves away, we play rook g8, and the rook has kind of encircled black's pieces, come all the way around, and will take on g7. So Ivanchuk took on g5, but now you can see that black's king is in huge trouble here. It's running out of squares, and it simply can't get out of the way, and white is going to take on g7, and the game is over. I just love this strategy of advancing the h-pawn. So Ivanchuk took on e5, Leko took on g7, and simply exchanged rooks, and took on e6. Now it's a clear pawn up. And what a pawn! This h-pawn is already only 3 steps away from the queening square, and with these pawns split, this is an absolutely hopeless position, and the game ended very shortly. There's another pawn about to drop. Of course, the knights can't be exchanged. It's a winning king and pawn ending. And here, Ivanchuk resigned. Well, it is completely hopeless. This pawn is about to fall, but basically the king is going to force the pawn home, or at least win the black knight, and then, well, it's terribly easy. White is just a piece up. A very instructive endgame performance from Peter Leko, who squeezed Ivanchuk's position beautifully there. More exciting chess to come in later rounds. Thanks for watching my play of the day. Do check out my YouTube channel as well. Thanks a lot.